What a spring. I've been to Kansas City, Chicago, and several places in between. I've bought some collections, sold a bunch of books, sent some things off to CGC, and have since gotten them back. And I even snagged a few books off of my wish list for this year, and even a previous list as well. The highlight of the spring was spending the last weekend of April in Chicago for C2E2 and the Chicago Toy Show. I brought the camera along with me so you wouldn't miss out on the fun. Let's catch up, chat about some of the key issues that I've pulled out to share with you, and of course, we're going to have some convention floor montage action. So let's get into it. The excitement all started back in March with Planet Comic-Con Kansas City. The show was pretty good for us, but I didn't have much time to get out to make any content. I had lined up a few things before the show that I wound up bringing home, the first of which is Beware number 13. Get you a good look at it here. This issue was published by Trojan Magazines and it came out in January 1955, which is pretty late for a pre-code book. The Comic Code Authority actually started in 1954, which pretty effectively brought the horror and crime comics party to an end. The following issue of Beware would actually be the series' last, and this was the fate that most pre-code titles suffered. For me, Beware isn't a title that I'm interested in putting together, like a complete run of or anything, but this issue appealed to me due to the spooky haunted house vibes of the cover, and my buddy Tom with Middle School Geek Comics had this one, and I instantly knew that I was going to bring it home. My other notable pickup from Kansas City wasn't even a comic book. My friends at Tater Tot Comics had posted some great carded TMNT action figures they had come in on consignment, and they were nice enough to bring one of them for me to the show. So anytime you can save that cross-state trip, that's pretty awesome. So my other pickup was this carded Warrior Bebop action figure. So I can get the focus right. There we go. And this is from the Warriors of the Forgotten Sewer series. It came out late in the TMNT toy line. I knew it was a tough later figure when I saw it, so I fairly enthusiastically said that I'd take it, and then we worked out the logistics. Now, after doing some additional research on it, it turns out this is actually the most desirable version of this particular figure. What sets it apart is that the weapons inside are silver. The figure was released with a variety of different colors of weapons, but the silver weapons are significantly more valuable than the others, I found out. It may be a little rough around the edges, it's got lots of corner dings, the bubbles got some crunching, but it's still a cool figure, and I'm glad that I have it in my slowly growing collection of carded TMNT figures. After we got back from Planet, I had a brief reprieve, but the next Como comic book show was just around the corner. Putting the finishing touches on that show really ate up a lot of time and energy, but despite all of that, I spotted a book on an online auction that has been a bit of a white whale for me for the last several years. I ultimately decided that now was the time, and even though the price went a bid or two above where I was hoping to call it quits, I finally managed to bring home a copy of Crime Patrol 16. If this looks familiar to you, this was actually one of the books that was on my 2023 wish list that I didn't wind up picking up last year, but I also didn't roll it over into this year's list either. Crime Patrol 16 and I have a pretty established history. I passed on a 3.0 restored copy for like $300 back in 2016, and it's eluded me ever since. What's cool about this one is it's just the second EC horror cover behind War Against Crime number 11, and they both shared the same cover date though, with February and March 1950 being the month that EC officially switched gears into horror. I've always liked this Johnny Craig cover. I mean, not that anybody's going to be surprised by that, but Crime Patrol 16 also happens to be just the second appearance of everybody's favorite horror host, the Crypt Keeper. Just a few days before the Como show, I received a call after work one day, and the next thing I knew, I was driving a couple of towns over to pick up an original owner Silver Age Amazing Spider-Man collection. I'm always happy to see this kind of stuff come in, but unfortunately the condition was a little lower than what I'd hoped for. But that actually prompted me to finally get around to submitting some books I'd been sitting on and get those over to CGC. One of the books had a few missing pieces that got into the art panels a bit, and I've had another key book for about a year that had a similar problem, so this was going to be a great case study to see how the books graded out. I also picked up a book at the Como show that needed to be switched over from CBCS to CGC, so it was getting thrown into the mix as well. Thankfully, CGC was set up at C2E2, so I could drop all of these books off first thing Friday morning and lighten my load for the rest of the weekend. Now that we've made it up to C2E2, it's time for some convention footage. Hey everybody, I'm here at C2E2 2024, and let's hit the sales floor and see what all's going on here. So here's the worst part about these major conventions. I have a ton of friends on this sales floor right now, and I don't have a damn clue where they're at. So maybe we can find them. Let's see how it goes. And this is what most of a comic convention is, just walking around. It's super glamorous. I bought a bit more at C2E2 than I honestly expected to. My plan for the weekend was to bring home a big item from the Chicago Toy Show, so behaving at C2E2 was step one of that plan. Now, despite my plan, I came out of the show with 5 new books. And they are Captain America, number 100. Never had a copy of this one, believe it or not. Doctor Strange, 179. Iron Man, number 12. Thor, 169. And last but not least, Weird Science, number 8. The Marvel books were actually the last non-major key issues that I'm missing from my 12-cent Marvel run, leaving just a total of 4 books that I need before I officially have every single 10-cent Marvel superhero comic. Now, unfortunately, the 4 I'm missing are going to be pretty painful, as I still need Tales to Astonish 27, Daredevil number 1, Journey into Mystery 83, and Hulk number 1. Weird Science 8 is a book from my 2024 wish list, so if you wanted to know more about the reasons why I picked this one, you can check that video out. And honestly, I'm pretty happy with the copy I came home with. I picked it up from Red Hood Comics, who had this amazing spread of pre-code horror books at the show. He just picked up this collection, and it was pretty impressive. One last comic I picked up over the weekend actually came from the toy show, where I was surprised to find multiple copies of Harvey Comics' Monster in My Pocket, number 1. I've never seen a copy of this book in person before, and I grew up loving Matchbox's tiny little rubber monster figures, so there was no way I was going to leave this thing behind. I don't know how well you guys can see it, but there are actually several red Monster in My Pocket figures on the top of the shelf back there. Just so you know, I'm not BSing. I've loved Monster in My Pocket for years at this point. And I guess to wrap up Chicago, the last pickup to share with you guys from the trip was actually the very first thing I bought, and this came from STL Comics in St. Louis. This is a carded 1989 Toy Biz Batman. I cannot tell you how many hours I played with the one I had of these as a kid. Thankfully, they remain really affordable all these years later, and the member berries are very strong with this one. I don't have this exact figure, but I have one of my older original Batman figures. I still have my 89 Batmobile with both missiles. It's on a shelf over here on the other side of the room, but this thing just brings back so many amazing memories from back in the day. So for, I think, the $30 it cost, there was just no way to pass this up. And it's something I'd passed a number of times because it's just one of those, you know, they're not hard to find. They're not expensive. It's like, I'll get it someday. I'll get it someday. And generally what winds up happening is I put that off too long and then I have to pay for it later on. So not this time. Next up, let's take a look at my CGC submission. Well, I mean, technically it was 2 submissions, one for grading and one for reholder. As I mentioned earlier, I picked up an ASM collection. It was so early, in fact, that the first issue in the collection was Amazing Spider-Man #2, which we all know is the first appearance of the Vulture. It's a pretty cool book. Unfortunately, it had quite a few obvious problems, including a piece missing from the front cover and a couple pieces missing from 3 interior pages that impacted the art. This is the kind of book that can be a little annoying to sell, as you can often find yourself going back and forth with a potential buyer over what the grade of the book really is. When you get down into the lower grades, it's really easy to get hung up on just a few different defects and just kind of how that all cumulatively adds up. Sometimes I think getting the grade right on the lower end can be harder than getting the grade right on the higher end. Now, if you couple that with my curiosity about how the multiple missing pieces would impact the grade, I knew very early on that if this book didn't sell at the Como show immediately, I was going to get it slabbed. And as you can see, it came back a CGC 1.0, not a bad grade for this book. It's got, of course, this missing piece down here is kind of the main problem. So you can get her focused. So that's the big thing as far as presentation, but it's got tape. It's rough. It's a 1.0, but it's all there. Blue label, thankfully. Always excited to see that. And honestly, the 1.0 was on the upside of my expectations. I had hoped that it would get the 1.0, but I really wouldn't have been surprised if it did come back a 0.5, like I said, with those multiple pages that were impacted by a missing piece. Now, my main beef with this book is that there are multiple tears and creases that were not flattened out prior to the book being encapsulated, which is just a huge pet peeve of mine. I'm really meticulous about making sure all of my books present as well as humanly possible when I bag and board them, and it doesn't matter if it's my stuff or the stuff that goes in my inventory. So to see this thing come back from CGC in the state it was in was a little aggravating. So that's a bummer, but you know, still, ASM2 on the wall is never a bad thing. The next entries on my submission were a pair of Batman 121s. I've been a big Mr. Freeze fan since I was a little kid, watching Batman the Animated Series after school, and last summer I picked up what would be my 3rd copy of this book. And like the ASM2, it had an interior issue where the very last page was missing a decent-sized piece that impacted a large portion of the issue's last story panel. There's a video from last summer when I picked this book up if you want to know a little bit more of the story or see some more of this book. So check that out. The best part about this missing piece is that it's thankfully not from the Batman story, but you know, still, it was kind of a big issue. I was borderline concerned that enough was missing that this one might be hit with an incomplete. I expected the high end for this one to be a 1.8, and it actually came back a 1.5. So, not bad. Honestly, I'm fine with this. I'm much happier with a 1.5 than I would have been a 1.0. And like I mentioned with the ASM2, it's just nice having this thing slabbed to remove any further discussions about where to put the grade on it, because I've had that conversation many times since I picked this one up right at a year ago. The second Batman 121 is actually my personal copy of this book, and it's the very first one I ever picked up. A good while back, I stood with my original 2 copies of this book, and I kept going over them, and I always came back with the response of, they're the exact same grade. For different reasons, but the same grade. The first copy was sent off to CBCS, and it came back a 2.5. I finally sent off my original copy with this submission, and it's official. It too is a 2.5. So, not too bad. I remember buying this. I just randomly wandered into a comic shop in Kansas City. When I first picked it up, it had a stamp of some sort stuck to this corner, and I was able to just kind of meticulously work and get it off. But I paid $40 for this thing when I picked it up a little over a decade ago, by just randomly wandering into that shop that day. So that's a pretty awesome find for that much money. And I'm glad it came out this grade, because I was going to keep whichever one came back higher. And the fact that I can hang on to this one as the same essentially as the CBCS copy makes me really happy, since it is the original one I picked up. The last issue in my grading submission was a copy of Giant Size X-Men #1 that I bought off of a longtime customer at the Como show. It came to me as a restored CBCS 5.5, and unfortunately when the book was originally graded, it was during that brief period where CBS used this awful dark blue bordered logo or label with the rivets around the edge, and I mean, it's just gross. So I knew instantly that I was going to crack this thing out. I'd give it a good cover cleaning and then submit it to CGC. I knew it was restored going in, so I wasn't too interested in investing more money into having it pressed and taking that time, because there just wasn't a lot of upside to it value-wise. I'd also prepared myself for it to drop down to a 5.0 from a 5.5 with the crossover. Now, unfortunately, they were not that kind, as it actually came back a restored 4.5, which is a bummer, but, you know, what can you do? Needless to say, that full point drop and the grading fee really kind of cut into the margin on this one. But hopefully strong word of mouth about X-Men 97 will help keep the value of this one where it doesn't slip into the red, and I can still, you know, at least get my money back out of it. You know, the customer is a really good guy, bought a lot of stuff with me, so when he was ready to cash out, you know, I probably paid I did pay more than I really wanted to, but he's been a good customer, so I hooked him up, and, you know, I should be okay. That said, it's still a great book, and some collector out there is going to be thrilled to have it in their collection. The final part of my CGC submission consisted of 2 books that went in for a reholder. The first one of these was my 5.0 copy of Tales of Terror Annual #3. I picked this book up from a friend last fall, and at the time we didn't realize it had an issue with the outer well seal. When I got it home, I realized that the entire bottom seam of the case was open, and it was starting to slowly creep around the corners. So I did the only common sense thing I could think of. I taped down all 4 corners and then put some in the middle with painter's tape, just to keep everything where it should be until I got around to sending it in for a reholder. Thankfully, the grade didn't change. It came back to me as a 5.0, just like it went in. And the best part is now I know it's safe and sound inside of this new outer well. So I was very happy with that. But now I have a confession for you guys. I have saved the best book for last, so I hope nobody skipped out early. The final reholder book is one that I've owned for about a decade, and one that is probably appreciated more than any book I've bought to date. Now, let me get it out of my handy new comic shell. You may recognize the comic shell from a video I did previously, but this is the new and improved version that I've had for a bit now, and hopefully I'm going to cover in more detail at some point in time. If you're interested in the comic shell, you can check in the description down below for a discount code for you to use when you order your own. It's hands down one of my favorite collecting accessories. The reason I decided to reholder this book was mostly because I've listened to my buddy Ryan from Automatic Comics talk about how awesome the new CGC pedigree labels are for months and months at this point. And I've got to say, he's not wrong. I'm extremely happy with the new labels presentation for my copy of Detective Comics number 58, the first appearance of the Penguin. When I first bought this book, it was raw, it was being sold on eBay, and it actually came with the original certificate that Heritage sent with it when they sold it as part of the Davis Crippen or D copy pedigree. The book only grades out at a 2.5, which I learned is fairly common for several of the early detective keys from this pedigree. I was actually able to have a nice conversation with CGC CEO Matt Nelson about the pedigree at C2E2. Now, despite the low grade, it presents really well, and as a guy who collects first appearances of the Bats Rogues Gallery, you got to take what you can get with some of these early issues, especially with increases in values that have come to the Golden Age books in recent years. I'm more than happy to be a 2.0 to 3.0 collector when it comes to these significant Golden Age keys. I mean, have you had a chance to see the new pedigree labels firsthand? This was my first time as far as like owning one and really having one in hand. If you've seen them before, tell me what you think of them down in the comments. I'm really pleased with how they look, especially when contrasted with the plain old blue label that this book used to have. My hope is that you are all safe from the hordes of cicadas that are emerging now that the spring temps are starting to work their way up to summer temps. Just outside of where I'm currently sitting, they've begun their unrelenting chatter, and unfortunately, this is usually an August problem for us around here, so it's gonna be a long summer. It's still spring for now though, and the spring top 10 comics lists are up next on the content calendar. I've already got the books picked out for the first video, and that should be coming your way next week. That said, I know things may be tough for some of us right now, but if you're in the position to pick up some comics for your PC at the moment, it's a great time to do so. Get out to small comic book and collectible shows in your area and see what you can find. If you've got dealers and vendors that actually follow current market values, no matter how painful that may be, I mean, believe me, there are so many great opportunities out there right now. Be sure to do your research though, because despite the fact that those boom prices are as stale as that package of crackers you found in the back of the cabinet, there are some guys who seem to be ready and willing to die on that hill. Condolences to them. Thanks for hanging with me for this long in the video. I hope you enjoyed the convention footage, or sad lack thereof when it came to the Chicago Toy Show, as well as checking out some of the new things I've managed to get my hands on recently. Get prepared, because the top 10s are going to be coming in hot and fast. Collect responsibly, and I'll see you in the next one.